So, welcome again, everyone, to Faith for the Climate's final webinar of 2024. As I said earlier, as everyone was joining, it's been a very eventful year. It's been a year of super elections with some expected results, like in countries like the UK, some political earthquakes in countries like the US, some uncertainties in France, and also some other very big democracies have gone to the polls, such as India and Indonesia. We've still got global nightmares unfolding, geopolitical nightmares, especially in the Middle East. We've got intensifying extreme weather events. And at the same time, we are seeing the profits of oil and gas companies continue to skyrocket. And for many of you who might have been following the recently concluded UN climate talks in Baku, Azerbaijan, COP29, you might be feeling very deflated and frustrated at the moment about the outcome. It's the 3rd of December, so for those of you who are Christian, here we are at the beginning of Advent, which for many Christians is a time of waiting and preparation and even fasting in the lead up to Christmas. As in the words of the psalmist in Psalm 27, wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage, wait for the Lord. Now, Faith for the Climate is a diverse network. We like quoting specific passages and traditions and teachings from each religion, but we also like to learn from each other's traditions. And I think my takeaway from reflections to do with Advent this season is that in the spirit of working towards climate justice, we have to wait and prepare, but it's not a passive waiting. It's not a passive preparation. So we're hoping that this webinar, coming at the time that it does at the end of this year, provides us a space for deep contemplation and reflection together, and rest as well, as we continue to plant and nurture more seeds for climate and environmental justice together across our different faith traditions and communities in the coming months and probably years. So the background, why did we want to do a webinar on the Fossil Fuel Treaty? Now, a lot of this stems back to our work when we were convening and coordinating the response of faith groups in the UK to the UN climate negotiations when they happened here in 2021 in Glasgow, COP26. And back then, through a process of consultation in which we worked very closely with Quakers in Britain, we drilled down to two main demands of the UK as COP26 president. We asked that the UK as COP26 president walk the talk and end all public subsidies for fossil fuels. That was the first demand. And the second demand was to commit and deliver its fair share of money for climate-related loss and damage. And these two demands remain relevant, and we are expanding on them to this day, which is why we are ramping up support for the Fossil Fuel Treaty now. We signed it back then, and if you see the faith endorsements page on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty website, you'll see the endorsements of many of the faith groups within our networks as well, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christians of different denominations. So this webinar is about how we can come together, because the moment, I think, has come that we really amplify and step up in our support for this campaign. So you'll be hearing quite specific stories of the speakers today who have all done important work for climate justice and in support of this treaty. They'll give you quite concrete examples and testimonies, not just about why their faith tells them to support the treaty, but how their faiths compel them to take care of people and planet, and how supporting the treaty is just one necessary part of this from them. So please learn from them and get inspired. And even though their examples will be very specific to their faith backgrounds, we like sharing and collaborating. So as you're listening, listen with an ear and a filter to see what about their testimonies or their experiences resonates with you in your faith tradition, in your faith community. Perhaps there might be some points of difference that you have questions about, and we welcome those questions. So please put those questions in the chat box. And if you're hearing about the treaty for the first time, think about what aspects of it excite you. What aspects of it do you have questions about? You might be thinking, this sounds really great, but I'm still having trouble figuring out how this might work for me or my community. So what further information or guidance would you like, either from the speakers who are speaking today or from Faith for the Climate? So let me, before introducing the speakers, just share the running order today with you. So that's my introduction done. We will have half an hour of input from Izzie McIntosh, Maggie Mason, Kamran Shezad, and Bokani Tshidzu. And then we'll have quite a bit of time for Q&A. So please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat box. We will pick them up later, or you can use the raised hand function when we open up for a Q&A, and then you can unmute and ask your questions as well. And then we will conclude at 1:25 with some spiritual reflections and observations from Giles. And then we will try to end promptly at 1:30. So without further ado, let's meet our first speaker. Izzie McIntosh is the Climate Campaign Manager at Global Justice Now, and she leads on demands for a fossil fuel treaty in the UK, and she's also shaping Global Justice Now's climate justice demands more broadly. And Izzie has also worked as a migrant justice campaigner focusing on immigration, detention, and deportations. So Izzie will start by setting the scene. She'll give us a quick summary of what happened at COP29, any aspects that are relevant for the treaty, and then she'll relate this to what today's webinar is trying to achieve. So how can UK faith groups support the campaign for a fossil fuel treaty? Izzie, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. I thought I'd start with just a really quick overview of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, what it is and who supports it. So it's a call for a treaty to phase out fossil fuels at the point of supply and for countries to work together for that, to that end, for a globally just transition. It's a proposal for a treaty at the moment. So the idea is countries are endorsing a treaty and saying they would sign up to negotiations on a treaty that is would be built around three pillars, which would be an end to fossil fuel expansion, a fair phase out of existing fossil fuel use, and a globally just transition to renewable energy. This has been really spearheaded by Pacific Island states, who obviously are facing really urgently existential issues as a result of the climate crisis. And there's now 14 governments signed up to support this proposed treaty and say that they would enter into negotiations on the basis of those three pillars. There's also parliamentarians, cities, scientists, and faith leaders all around the world, including, organizations like Faith for the Climate, that are signed up to endorse this treaty and say that this is something that we need. And the thing that's really key about it is that it's sort of seeking to work more quickly and fairly than COP currently can, because COP is a really important space and we're not at all saying that we should forget about it, but unfortunately it's just taking too long to call for the changes that we need. And there's really key reasons for that, and I actually think a really good way to demonstrate that is to look at this year's COP conference, which really felt kind of doomed from the start, to be honest. I think that's something I've heard echoed by a lot of people. It was in a petro state again, and that became really apparent when the COP president, the lead negotiator of the entire conference, called oil and gas a gift from God about 10 minutes into the conference. And obviously, aside from all of that, more recently the Trump victory was hanging really heavy over COP, so it was definitely a kind of a fractious year, and I think that was really reflected in some of the outcomes. So sort of 5 key takeaways were that, firstly, this year was really focused on climate finance and a new global goal for wealthy countries to give climate vulnerable countries in climate finance. Now, the goal that climate vulnerable countries wanted us to agree to, or wanted COP to agree to, was $1.3 trillion in climate finance per year. obviously that sounds like a massive amount, but when you think about the fact that the global economy is valued at about $100 trillion per year, um, it's actually a really small amount to tackle this crisis that is literally going to impact every single person on the planet. So, and particularly when you think about the fact that a lot of that money could come from sort of taxing polluting corporations who've made so much money from causing this crisis in the first place. So, unfortunately, we didn't get anywhere near that goal. The agreed amount in the end was $300 billion per year from wealthy countries. And actually, it was so fractious that COP nearly ended in no deal at all, because climate vulnerable countries were saying, we're actually not signing up to this and we're walking out of negotiations, reasonably in my view. But, it got there in the end, but with a very suboptimal goal. The second key takeaway is that there's been no progress on a fossil fuel phase out this year. A victory of last year's conference was that finally fossil fuels were an energy transition from fossil fuels specifically was targeted in last year's COP text. Saudi Arabia led the charge, with others, to have mention of fossil fuels removed from this year's COP text. So while it did reaffirm lots of stuff around an energy transition, we haven't progressed from last year's position. If anything, we might have gone a bit backwards, but not progressing even in itself is not something we can afford. We need to be making progress every single second, really. So another year without progress on that is a real problem. Third key takeaway is that once again, fossil fuel lobbyists outnumbered almost every country delegation at COP this year. So if we're wondering what's bringing about some of the issues I just talked about, maybe we can look there as a starter. And fourthly, I'd say that the UK government did come in with some kind of good stuff. Like, we've got a new emissions reduction pledge, which is in line with the UK Climate Change Committee's recommendation of how much the UK needs to reduce its emissions to tackle the climate crisis. That said, there's no detail yet on how that pledge will be achieved, and there's certainly no kind of like promises to tackle fossil fuels and to tackle to make sure that polluting companies like Shell and BP, those kind of UK companies, are the ones that have to kind of be the first to shoulder the financial burden of an energy transition. So my fifth key takeaway really is that I think this year, as I said, really demonstrated the need for a fossil fuel treaty and the need for a kind of new system of international cooperation on this. COP is really important, but there's key things that are holding it back. Firstly, the lobbyists, like I talked about, the fact that so many lobbyists are allowed so much space at COP. I mean, it's no wonder that we're not making progress on a fossil fuel phase out, because that's literally exactly what they're there to stop happening. Also, COP works on a consensus basis, which essentially means that every party has to agree to the final text. And that makes it really easy for kind of, Saudi Arabia is an example this year, but the UK has done it, the US has done it all the time, to just come in and torpedo progress by saying, okay, well, we're not signing up to that. That holds everything back. And it is a system that is very weighted towards kind of like the US and global North interests. So something that builds a coalition of the willing around kind of global South countries and climate vulnerable countries could be really powerful. So in terms of what we want to achieve with the Fossil Fuel Treaty in 2025, we really want to strengthen this call for a fossil fuel phase out and a globally just transition. And as I said, a lot of that's about kind of seeking endorsements, A, from governments to say that they would enter into negotiations on it, but B, from other actors as well, to create that kind of popular demand and that bottom-up demand for a globally just transition and for this system to phase out fossil fuels. That's going to be particularly important in the UK, obviously, because even under this new government, they're still going to need some persuading that this is a good idea and this is something that the UK should be involved in on a kind of good faith basis. So really, really important here. And faith communities really have a huge role to play, because faith communities have always played a huge role in climate justice. And already there's a strong contingent of global faith leaders calling for a fossil fuel treaty. But, the power of kind of your voices and the fact that you are respected as kind of like good faith climate justice campaigners is really, really important here. It could really add, make this call reach much further than it is already doing. In terms of the UK specifically, we've got lots of UK cities on board already. This year, we've managed to get Glasgow on board. One other major English city has just endorsed, but annoyingly, they haven't done their press release yet. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to tell you who they are yet, but news of that will be coming in time. We've got Unison, the UK, one of the UK's biggest unions, endorsing the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and lots of other local councils too. So really feels like this is starting to gather momentum in the UK. In 2025, we're really hoping to keep putting pressure on the Welsh government. We think an endorsement from them could really signal to the UK government that this is something that they need to take seriously. We want more major cities on board. We're particularly looking at Bristol in England, and Cardiff in Wales. So if you're in any of those places, obviously it would be great to have you involved in the campaign. And obviously, we also want more MPs and more trade unions on board to kind of lend that political legitimacy and build that bottom-up demand. Again, like the voices of faith leaders and people in the faith community have a big role here, and that's why we're working with Faith for the Climate. So we'd love to do things like an open letter from faith leaders, maybe joint local events with our networks. There's lots of other ideas we could talk about, but I know I'm at time now, so maybe we can fresh out a bit more in questions. And obviously you can contact me via Shanon and Faith for the Climate if you'd like to be more involved. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Izzie, especially for covering such a lot of ground in such a short space of time. Yeah, so one thing that we really do like about the Fossil Fuel Treaty at Faith for the Climate is how we can work on it at different levels, at local levels, subnational jurisdictions, cities, devolved governments, and also national governments, and how we as faith groups can kind of transcend the nationalism that happens at international negotiations as well. Many of us will have contacts in places in the global south, where there are communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, and we can work together and show solidarity with them through supporting this treaty. So thank you so much for that. Let's move on to our next speaker. So Maggie Mason, we're very pleased to have Maggie Mason. She was the coordinator, one of the coordinators of the successful legal challenge to the Cumbria coal mine, which you might have heard about recently because it was in the news. Initially, I thought she's a member of Global Justice Now. No, but she's the chair of the Board of Trustees of Global Justice Now as well. We've asked her to talk about how her faith and climate activism are connected and how working on the Fossil Fuel Treaty fits into this picture of the connection between her faith and activism. So over to you, Maggie.
Thank you. Can people hear me? I think I've been unmuted by the chair. I get a thumbs up from somebody? Great. So yes, it's lovely to be here with so many people of faith, and it's really, really lovely also to see some of my friends from my local Quaker community in Kendal here as well. I haven't actually done very much on the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I found a webinar about it some years ago and joined that with some of the international leaders. And all I've really done is suggest it to Global Justice Now as a campaign. So that's brilliant. That's now going ahead. But that's all I've done on it really. And I really want to make 3 points. So what's good about the Fossil Fuel Treaty, lessons from the Cumbria coal mine campaign, and also lessons, maybe takeaways for faith communities. My own faith will sort of feed in and out of this a bit, so bear with me on that. So the really good things for me about the Fossil Fuel Treaty are that it's unlike the COP process. It's trying to limit, which only try and limit demand for fossil fuels, is focusing on the supply. The second is that it's led by communities from the global south. And the other is that ordinary people in the UK can get involved in this and make their views known, as against all the stuff that's being pushed out by the right-wing press and saying that all the people in the UK, everybody's against this and must fight net zero, must abandon it, etc. So I think it's actually a very good way of people getting involved. So, I worked very hard on the coal mine to try and manage to stop the Cumbria coal mine, because I was a minerals and waste planner, and I knew that it was against our own legislation, really, as was eventually proved by the judge in the final hearing. But also, we do need to regulate supply, and the COPs constantly just try and play around with price mechanisms, which, as we all know, don't work. So one of the key things, again, about the being led by the Global South is that we really need to get a common view across the world. It sounds crazy, but that is what we need. We need the truth to be told. And if we're in contact with our friends elsewhere in the world, then that makes that possible. And that's what I've always found with Global Justice Now. It put us in touch with people in the Global South, and we learned to re-examine our own perspectives. So I'm going to go now into lessons from the Cumbria coal mine. Do forgive me if I keep looking to the side, because I must admit I've got some notes and I'm trying to follow them and not leave anything out. So the three things from the Cumbria coal mine are that the fossil fuel companies are totally ruthless and can capture governments. We saw that. You know, I saw all the submissions from the former UK government, and I signed off all the responses from a small charity here in Kendal called South Lakes Action on Climate Change that our legal team were putting in. And the former government's position matched those of the Australian owned mining company, as they'd written in, the Net Zero Watch group of right-wing MPs here in the UK, and many pronouncements from the Australian government. The whole attitude was picked up and just repeated by the government lawyers. We were lucky in that we had a great judge and a change of government, which meant that he saw through all that and said it was inconsistent, illogical, and basically unfair. And that we were right to say that even our own UK legislation on environmental impact assessment had been ignored by the government, and that was not right. Of course, we know that fossil fuel companies can capture countries and governments, because we're now seeing it in the US with Trump. It's as clear as mud. So the second real learning from our work on the Cumbria coal mine is that ordinary people can do fantastic things. You know, we really got the most amazing result. The ruling that quashed the planning permission for the coal mine was great, made a huge, important legal precedent, which I won't go into. But since then, the UK government has also said it won't do any more coal licenses at all. And also, they've changed the name of the Coal Authority, which gives out those licenses, to the Mining Remediation Authority, really signalling that that is the end of coal. And we really hope that all of these things will have an impact as well on Rosebank's work against the oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, and it's all being considered together. Now, we did amazing things. We raised £500,000 to pay for the public inquiry and the legal challenge, and 100,000 of that came from members of the public through crowd justice. To me, this shows that there is a huge understanding growing in the UK, in spite of what we see in the press and on social media, that understands that this is a really important thing that we have to tackle. And as a nice piece of delight, both SLAC and Friends of the Earth, that's South Lakes Action on Climate Change, both SLAC and Friends of the Earth, who are our partners in all of this, got £70,000 back, including we got £35,000 each from the UK government, and to our great delight and total unexpected, we got £35,000 each back from, each as an organisation, that is, of course, back from the West Cumbria mining. That was really, sometimes I say that the universe is with us, because really the result we got was incredible and very lucky, but we were right. The third takeaway from the coal mine is that this success came from a really dedicated but informal coalition of people. It wasn't really led by any particular group, and certainly not by a faith group, even though I was part of one. So in Cumbria, we had a WhatsApp group. Now there's about 100 people on it. Somebody organised a street corner event once a month up at the coal mine. We had visitors from Global Justice Now, and all sorts of other interesting people came along. I had nothing to do with that. Somebody else just ran with it. Coal Action Network were tremendously useful, and they set up, maybe you've heard of those, they set up demonstrations which were all legal at insurers, finance companies, and they were free to do so because they weren't involved in the court case. And they also have not dependent on memberships, so they're not watered down, if you like, by a very large and diverse group that you might have in a bigger organization. Fossil Fuel Free London helped us. Christian Climate Action were great because I had personal contacts with some of those from being once part of Operation Noah way back. And they did a lobby of all the enablers.
Sorry to interrupt, Maggie, but if you could wrap up in the next minute, that would be great.
Okay, that's fine. So all those people are really useful. But for the faith communities, I think the three takeaways are that this really rapid and radical U-turn is needed. We all know that on this call. But my point is that it needs everyone of good conscience and goodwill. I mean, I was raised in a Catholic family. I'm now a Quaker, but I worked with my quasi-atheist husband as an activist couple for years and years, for 46 years together. So I think we need to reach out to anyone who has faith to carry on trying, faith to carry on being compassionate, and they've got to be our friend. The powerful and rich don't want us to self-organize, but that's what we have to do. So I don't think the big faith communities will act really fundamentally to the lead. There will be statements made, but I really think that you need to support networks in your own area, and it takes all the tenets of your own faith, while recognizing that these are universal human qualities, whatever words are used. The right path leads into the company of the right people. Enjoy the journey.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was fantastic and really good to have your in-depth reflections. And I love what you said at the end as well, especially, your relationship with your quasi-atheist husband. I think that's a reality for so many of us in this network as well, just the kind of relationships that we have around us and the people we want to bring along. So thank you. And I also forgot to introduce you as a member of Kendal Quaker Meeting. So welcome, Quakers, today, especially if you're from Kendal Meeting. Now let's move on to our third speaker. Kamran Shezad is the qualified environmental specialist. He's the executive director of the Bahu Trust. He's one of the top 100 most impactful and influential environmental professionals in the UK and was very much involved in the crafting of Mizan, an Islamic covenant for the earth, which endorses the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty from an Islamic perspective. So Kamran, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you to all the other speakers too. Just to introduce you to Mizan, I'm going to share a link which you guys can also have a look at later. Mizan is a faith-inspired framework on safeguarding this very precious planet that we have, based on the teachings of Islam. It's for the Muslim world, but it also speaks to everybody. It doesn't just speak to Muslims and the Islamic world. Mizan is an Arabic word. It comes from one of the chapters in the Holy Quran, which talks about mercy. And it's a very environmental chapter, which the main theme of this particular chapter is balance, and how we enjoy the bounties and the blessings of God, but equally what we take with one hand, we give back with the other. So it's a very comprehensive document. It's also been described by the Vatican as the sibling to Laudato Si, and it was launched at the United Nations Environment Assembly, I believe in February just gone. As mentioned, it's very comprehensive. It's quite detailed in its approach. It goes further than any other document that we have seen in the Islamic world. It goes to the assessment of what the planet is facing right now. It goes to the theology, the ethics, the economy, the legislation, policy, activism. In fact, it's got five chapters. Chapter 1 is around the appraisal of the earth. Chapter 2 is the signs of God in the heavens and the earth. Chapter 3 is the ecological ethos and ethos of Islam. Chapter 4 is the equity and fairness and justice in sharing the sources of life. Chapter 5 goes through the principles and practices for tending the earth. And then there's an annex around what practical work we can do moving forward. And the beauty of Al-Mizan was that it wasn't just written by theologians or scholars, but initially by a dozen Muslim practitioners and scholars in the field of biodiversity, conservation, protected area planning, wilderness leadership, etc. Basically, individuals who have devoted their lives to addressing and resolving environmental problems. So, and then from there, it went to 200 institutes, Muslim and non-Muslim institutes around the world for their feedback. We've taken all their feedback. It's been endorsed by a handful of individual Islamic countries, but it is being lined up to be endorsed by ISESCO, which is the Islamic world's equivalent of UNESCO, for all the Islamic ministers for environment and climate change to endorse. So that in itself should be quite interesting when we get to that stage. Al-Mizan itself doesn't shy away from dealing with difficult and thorny issues such as human population growth, energy production, fossil fuels, climate change, the global economic system, how we produce and harvest the food we eat, genetically modified organisms, the loss of biodiversity, loss of wetlands. It goes through all sorts. But the one thing that we chose deliberately not to do with Al-Mizan is we don't seek to provide answers from the teachings of Islam, but to raise questions and challenges informed by the values and teachings of Islam. Because quite often, if you tell people what to do, we do the opposite. And we don't set out to tell people, whether they're Muslim or not Muslim, what to believe and what not to believe, or what a specific solution is, but rather to challenge the reader to seek solutions within the context of the Islamic framework and values and teachings. So that comes down to the particular non-fossil proliferation treaty. So we did decide specifically that we will not endorse any treaties, any campaigns, anything in particular, because we were quite conscious that we wanted to future-proof this document, because we didn't want something to become old news. And we were hoping to launch this at COP28 in Dubai. But the sad reality is, for all the reasons that Izzie mentioned earlier in her opening, is that we had no choice but to endorse the treaty. And I will quickly share screen just so I can show you the from the caption. So paragraph 1.11, it says from, let me just shorten it so I can see it on my screen. Okay, up until now, the efforts to hold back global climate change have focused on negotiating targets to regulate emissions, but not on phasing out production of the fuels that generate them. At COP28, whilst we applaud the first-time inclusion of citing fossil fuels, the root cause of the climate crisis, I mean, it only took us 28 years to get there, we feel that the call for a transitioning away from fossil fuels is a far cry from phasing out fossil fuels. Scientists have warned that the failure to call for a phasing out of fossil fuels is devastating and dangerous, given the urgent need for action to tackle the climate crisis. Governments continue to approve and subsidize the prospecting, extraction, and production of oil, gas, and coal, producing far more fossil fuels than is consistent with the target of limiting the rise of global warming to 1.5. Hence, we have no option but to endorse the proposed Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, a framework that will enable countries to negotiate the phasing out of fossil fuel production in a way that is just, fair, and transparent, and to commit to an equitable transition for affected workers and climate vulnerable communities. Shanon did ask me to share some of the challenges that we also faced in writing this and tackling some of those issues. I won't go through them right now because it is recorded, and because We're still talking to lots of ministers and government leaders. It's important that we have some of those conversations, those difficult conversations, in private sometimes. But as you can expect, because we have been in Al Mizan, we have been quite hard hitting and in some of the things. So you can see how that will have rattled some of government leaders. But hence why we had to, we felt that it was so important, and we feel that this particular campaign and treaty will go on for another decade or two, and it will grow. The movement will grow bigger and bigger. So we can't see this becoming an outdated campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamran Bhai. And yeah, all the best blessings to you as you take this work forward. So last but not least, let me introduce Bokani Tshidzu, who is Right Now Campaign Officer at Operation Noah, where she coordinates communication about the campaign, the Bright Now campaign, with partners and liaises with religious organizations about divesting from fossil fuels. Operation Noah is also celebrating their 20th anniversary this year, so let's give them a lot of love. I think we have a link that we'll post in the chat where you can support Operation Noah with its work. Before Bokani tells us about how the treaty builds on Operation Noah's body of work and how they plan to take it forward, I'll also say that Bokani is also an amazing visual artist, and she has at least one major artwork that has been acquired for the permanent collection of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. Is that right? So an amazing, amazing person. So thank you, Bokani. Over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to join you this afternoon. So I think I might introduce Operation Noah because we're a tiny but mighty charity, so maybe not everyone will have heard of us. So Operation Noah is an ecumenical charity, which means we work across different Christian organizations and denominations. And as you heard, we've been going for 20 years. And really, our work is about inspiring the church's response and action on the climate crisis, one of the first faith-based climate charities in the UK. And we continue to draw inspiration from our Christian faith, and I'll come to that when I talk about some of the lessons we've learned from the divestment movement. And our work is simultaneously informed by the latest scientific research. We think this is really important. And also our hope is based on that taking of action. So one of our biggest campaigns has been the divestment campaign. So we encourage UK churches, especially to divest their shares, so sell off any shares in fossil fuel companies. And when I first joined ON in 2020, this seemed quite a controversial thing. And it seemed like a really fringe idea that churches might do something with their investments in response to the climate crisis. So it really is saying how far we've come, both as Christians in the UK, but also I think societally in the UK, how far we've come away from that being a niche and sort of fringe movement to being really the mainstream, by which I mean most denominations in the UK, including the Church of England, which manages about 10.4 billion in assets, the Methodist Church, and even longer ago, the Quakers, of course, have all moved their investments away from fossil fuel companies and are now looking more actively at investing in climate solutions, which is the other important side of that coin. The Catholic Church has yet to make a similar divestment commitment, so please continue to pray for and help encourage that as well. But as I say, that's been a fairly successful campaign that we've seen in terms of getting the conversation going. And I'm going to share kind of the three lessons that I think are why that has been, and what we might learn from it in order to use as we go forward with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I think is a really important step that people of faith and their churches and institutions and organizations can sign up to and endorse. So the first really important lesson was really recognizing that our faith is an important starting point. So this idea of an ecological conversion and starting with our faith as a motivator, as a responsibility that we all have both towards each other and towards creation and the planet. So really thinking about, well, what does it mean to love our neighbor? One of the things that we found really helpful was in really pointing out what dioceses were still investing in oil and gas and why there was a moral issue with this, and really aligning this industry with other industries that we don't want to be supporting because of our ethical and moral foundations. And one of the things that we found really helpful in that, starting with prayer and connecting with community, was in centering examples from those facing the sharpest impacts of the climate crisis. I think sometimes it can be very easy for us to get lost in some of the really alarming numbers that we read in IPCC reports and some of the huge reports that we see, but really dwelling on individuals who are affected, particularly in the global south. This seemed a really important aspect of making this very real, but also showing actually some of the flooding that's happening in this country is also affecting some of the poorest communities. So really showing the injustice of how the climate impacts are playing out already was key. Then taking an impact and thinking about, how does this impact on us as a local parish, as a diocese, and as a national church? So these aspects are encouraging individual parishes to sign a divestment commitment as a way of saying, look, even if we don't have investments at this moment, we are wanting to shine a light on what our diocese is doing and what our national church is doing. So thinking perhaps at those levels of what are the sizes of organizations and how can we make an impact is also something else we might want to think about when we look at how we encourage organizations to be part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then the last thing I'd emphasize is how thinking about, once a divestment commitment was made, so let's say somebody has signed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, what is it that they can do to amplify that decision? A lot of people complain about virtue signaling, but in all our faith traditions, there is an importance placed on being a light that we don't hide under a bushel, being an example. And yes, of course, that's challenging and it does hold us up to a higher standard of behavior, and I should hope so. But it does mean that others can see that example and maybe be inspired by it and maybe show that not only is it possible, but actually it's something that leads to maybe more joy and a more sense of a deeper connectedness. And also it means we can speak with credibility on the changes that we need to see in the world. So not only recognizing and taking the actions, but also talking about those actions that we've taken and amplifying those so that we can lead by example. So for example, when the Church of England made its divestment commitment, this was covered by international press, and many people that look to the Church of England as an investor that they are inspired by were given that example. So just to wrap up, I would say that political advocacy is really, really key. And we looked at divestment because obviously how investors move is part of a systems level change. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is part of that system level changes that we need to see that can be really effective in getting the government, which looks at mandates like faith groups, for a sense of direction. We are important. Faith organizations have made huge and important changes societally over the years. and this is another chance to do so.
Thank you so much, Bokani, and thank you to all our speakers. So, Roche and Rebecca, if you can help to pin the speakers again, I'll open it up to questions now. So everyone, please use the raised hand function if you can find it, or if you raise your hand, maybe Roche and Rebecca or Giles can tell me who's raising their hands because I can't see at the moment. You can put your questions in the chat box. So yeah, questions, please, everyone. Give it a minute for people to collect their thoughts. Carolyn Heyman, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I'm a Quaker from Hampstead. I was listening last night to to a podcast about the complete failure of the plastics treaty and the resistance of the plastics manufacturers to do anything other than say that it was all about recycling. And personally, I've always felt that acting on the supply side is really fruitless because these people are paid to produce as much fossil fuels as possible. So I would really like to know a bit more about why you think acting on the supply side is not only important, I agree it's important, but how it can actually succeed as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. Maybe we can let Izzie answer that first, and Maggie, if you wanted to add anything.
Great, sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, to the point about the plastics treaty, I certainly think there's going to be, I've been watching that quite closely as well. And I think there's certainly going to be some really important lessons learned about kind of the pathways forward for the fossil fuel treaty and ways to kind of reduce the risk of a sort of similar situation when we move into negotiations for the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I'd say on acting on the supply side, what we've, a lot of the discourse, as Maggie was kind of touching on, a lot of kind of the discourse and people's awareness around like fossil fuels and energy reduction is to do with kind of like day-to-day stuff that they can do. And that is just not stopping fossil fuel companies from producing oil. Like it's too profitable for them right now. It's too like subsidized and supported for them to stop right now. So although there's these kind of and oil companies make these noises, right, where they're like, oh yeah, we're like looking at other fuels as well, and like what's your it was BP that came up with the phrase carbon footprint. So it's they make these noises, but actually they want to carry on producing oil because it's the most profitable thing for them to do. So what we need is a treaty that will take that system on head on and kind of dismantle it a bit so that actually fossil fuels stop being the most profitable way for these energy companies to operate, and that we're moving all into a transition of using renewable energy for our energy sources instead. But I think that and that in itself will then reduce some of the demand for fossil fuels. So it's a cyclical thing. You need, as I think it's the treaty's chair says, you need to be cutting with both halves of the scissors. So you need to be doing the demand reduction, but you also need to be doing the supply reduction, because that this is a powerful lobby that kind of has hold of our climate processes and our the way that we're tackling the climate crisis at the moment. So it's not just about the energy supply itself, it's also about kind of like the power structures and how we dismantle them to move us fairly and quickly through to a solution to this crisis.
Great, thank you. Maggie,
Yes, I might have something to add here for you, Carolyn, because I was a minerals and waste planning officer, and I was used to writing reports on whether or not any kind of new minerals and waste minerals applications would be approved or not. And it was normal to us prior to the last government to look at the need for those things. And you looked at it, and if there wasn't a need, you refused them because they all have a bad impact on people who live around them and, as we now know, the environment. And for coal, oil and gas particularly, the key impact that you should be assessing at the point of allowing an extraction is the effect on the whole world of those fossil fuels being burnt. And so we would normally have expected to have looked at that and refused it in this case. But the last government pulled away from all sorts of legislation and regulations that we had and watered them all down, and began to say that as long as any company thought it might be profitable and thought there might be a global demand, who were we to stop them? And that kind of neoliberal view had crept into what is normally a really good point to stop something which is going to be harmless worldwide. And the point of extraction is the time when you can stop it. You have to stop it at that point, otherwise it's too late. And this was recognised by the judge in the final hearing. So it is a very important point that we can stop it at that point. Every country either has a planning permission and development consent, but also a licensing idea. So all these wealthy countries still with fossil fuels who don't really need those anymore because they have the money to invest in decarbonisation, and they're just exporting it and allowing other international players, fossil fuel companies, to come in and export it. So it is very, very important. I can't speak to the plastics treaty because they don't have that single point of origin that the extraction of coal, oil and gas has. We need to stop new ones. And at least we have tried to make some kind of example on that in the UK.
Thank you so much, Maggie, and thank you, Carolyn, for that very thoughtful question that we've had an in-depth response to. I'm going to give it to Naomi. Let's make this the last question because we want to finish on time. Naomi, Director of Eco-Judaism, welcome, and your question, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the amazing talks. I have a question for Kamran, please. I'm really inspired by what you said about the Al-Mizan. Question is, are you using that in Islamic faith school education, or are you looking very much at the sort of governmental level or the sort of institutional level within your faith structure? That's just something I'm interested in because we're doing some Jewish environmental education work, and a document like that would be extremely valuable.
Thank you. It's a good question. We wrote it in a way that speaks to different people at different levels. And for them, see, ultimately, we do understand it's still a piece of text over 50 pages, and we have to empower different sectors to convert that into language that suits them. I know my son is writing a 10-year-old version for other children. I know the Jordanian government, for instance, have taken Al-Mizan and are starting to look at how they can implement that into some of their laws and in some of their wildlife planning. So partly we are quite inspired by the Laudato Si movement. That how do we, so we are going to rip off a lot of the ideas, to be honest, and work very closely with them to see how can we have research based on it, how can we engage with communities, how can we engage with governments. It's very early days for us, and so we're building the movement slowly and organically so that it gives people time to digest it. But I fully I read between the lines some of the challenges that we have even trying to make these texts into actualizing them into practical work. So there's lots happening.
Thank you so much, Kamran. And maybe as a final thought, Bokani, does Operation Noah have any schools resources as well? Or yeah.
I think I would have to have a think about that, but we have a Tenets of the King, which individual parishes can go through, and is a little booklet and a course. But we are in discussions about how do we support the next generation of campaigners as well. So yeah, watch the space.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there are many other questions, but I'd like to keep to time. So thank you, everyone. There's also some amazing insights in the chat box. Linda Murgatroyd, Kath Atley, David Hillman, Amandeep, Korman. We'll try and build those insights into a follow-up email that we'll send to all of you. So we will send a recording of this to everyone who's registered, and also just any links that have been shared in the chat and some insights. So this is now all that's left for me to do is hand this over to Giles to maybe close this for us.
Thank you so much, Shannon, and many thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks to those who've contributed and to our speakers. It's been really fascinating. And I think two very quick reflections of whether it's 129. One is how important it is that we build our relationships within the network, both within faith traditions and beyond them. As Bokani said, faith traditions are very important in all of this, and we keep it going. We take the long view and we keep on going, but we also try to live in love and hope. So many thanks for helping those relationships to be built today. And I think the other thing I want to say is just keep on turning up. It's the beginning of Advent for Christians. We start the new year, and many of us in St. John's renewed our rule of life this week, and part of the rule of life is about just keeping on turning up and keeping on doing it. The amount of work which is going on is very encouraging, even in a world where it seems like things are going in the wrong direction. And if we don't keep doing it, then there certainly won't be a difference. I just want to very quickly mention, this is slightly off topic, but related, the Climate and Nature Bill, which is having its second reading on the 26th of January. It's amazing that it's got its second reading. We put some information about it in our newsletter yesterday. If you can encourage your local MPs to go to that debate and support the bill, that's really crucial. Not to detract from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is amazing, and I'm really pleased that we're supporting it. I'm just going to finish with a prayer. It's a prayer from Christian Aid, which I hope is appropriate. If praying isn't your thing, then feel free to listen or do something else, and then we'll let you go and get your lunch. So let's pray. God, who is love, you created a world of community, richness, and love. But human greed has brought separation, destruction, and injustice. So we pray for opportunities and boldness to act together with others, to break down the barriers of our selfish desires. We pray that our collective actions will be driven by wisdom and love, so that we will be agents for justice as we seek a world fruitful for all people and all of creation. In your holy name. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Giles. All that's left for me to say is have a blessed Advent. Those of you who are observing, Merry Christmas when it gets here, Hanukkah Sameach when it gets here, Happy Yule, Happy Winter Solstice, a blessed 555th Gurpurab to our Sikh members. And yeah, see you next year. Thank you, everyone. It's been lovely.
Thank you. God bless.
And thank you to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.